Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us at this event hosted by the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Election Reformers Network to discuss their new report on partisan incentives in election administration and how they can be neutralized. My name is Grace Panetta. I'm a senior politics reporter at Insider, and I am so happy and thrilled to be here today. Thank you so much to the Bipartisan Policy Center and Election Reformers Network for having me. And we have a fantastic panel here today to discuss the report, its findings, and its implications for 2022 and beyond. On our panel, our speakers today are Matt Weil, Director of the Elections Program at the Bipartisan Policy Center, Kevin Johnson, Founder and Executive Director of the Election Reformers Network, Chris Harvey, the former elections director in Georgia, and Philadelphia City Commissioner Seth Bluestein, who's also a member of the Bipartisan Policy Center's task force on elections. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for everyone who's tuning in. We're going to speak about the report itself and partisanship in election administration, and then we'll take questions later on in the program. To submit questions, you can either drop them on the chat on the YouTube stream or tweet them by tagging the Bipartisan Policy Center at BPC_bipartisan or with the hashtag BPC Live. And with that, let's get into today's program and discussing this new report on neutralizing partisan incentives in election administration. So going first to Kevin, I'm wondering if you can kick us off talking a little bit about what partisan incentives in elections even mean, the findings of the report, and why this all matters.
Yeah, thank you so much, Grace. And just to say, it's great to be here, and a quick shout out to Matt and the team at BPC working together on this report. So I guess the way to summarize the issue here really is that our system has always been unusual in having election officials have pretty substantial ties to political parties. Many are elected in partisan elections, which means they sort of have that political background. Many are appointed in processes that parties are involved in. We've done that for a long time. For the most part, we've managed it. But now we have political parties who have ties to, we have election officials who have ties to political parties that see each other as existential threats to the nation and its democracy. And that means that we need to really rethink what the safeguards are that protect our elections against partisanship and against sort of the influence of political parties. I think the good news is there's a lot that we can learn on how to do this, both from things we already do well in the US and from the fact that so many other countries have systems that effectively sort of separate election administration from political parties more effectively.
Yeah, super interesting. And next, I want to go to Matt, one of the other people involved in the report. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about sort of how this unique system of partisanship manifests itself and how it sort of affects our elections and what the implications are.
Great, and thank you, Grace, for moderating this event. I think on behalf of the BPC and the Election Reformers Network. I mean, at its base, Americans expect that elections are going to result in legitimate winners, right? That individual candidates that receive the most votes are going to be duly elected. And that's just how it's been for the majority, or hopefully all of our existence. But more and more, we're seeing these partisan incentives get in the way. And I think why we decided to do this report was because we thought we were getting close to a point in American history where people in positions of legitimate power that were duly elected to those positions and have the kind of the keys to the kingdom, the ballots and the voting machines, could do illegitimate things and in fact end up putting in power people who are not duly elected. As Kevin pointed out, this is a somewhat unique process. Most established democracies don't have partisans in the system. I don't think at this point we can go back to that. I don't think that that's a feasible option, but we can do things on the margins that would have a huge impacts. I'm happy to talk about these more, but we should be codifying things that have just been ethical norms into law. We should continue to expand things like regularized auditing to make sure that we're checking the people. But I think ultimately, the problem that we have now is that the incentives are, even at the local level, to be partisan as a stepping stone to future office. And that is something that has to be countered both in culture and with a legal framework around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kevin, I know one of the things that the Election Reformers Network, sort of the phrase you all have used, is that the model of partisans acting in good faith is no longer working and that that system needs to be changed. What does that sort of kind of mean in practice? Why is this model of partisan officials sort of acting in good faith and accepting the rules of the game no longer working?
There are a lot of forces behind that. We have, such an intensification of the division between the two parties, and that's kind of been going on over the last couple of decades. And that's been echoed in the kind of changes and reinforced by the changes in the media landscape, where we've gone from kind of a small number of channels that are more or less in the center to, just ubiquitous news that can be of any sort of specific, narrow perspective, and so really allows people to kind of hibernate or be just in one lane and not really be exposed to different perspectives. So there are a lot of larger forces that are intensifying kind of the degree of divide between the political parties. I think for our purposes and the purpose of the report, I think the important thing is to find out ways that we can just safeguard the influence of all of that. It's not something that our country can tackle anytime soon. That's just an evolution that's going on. But we need to safeguard the impact of all that in this critical space of elections and how to make sure elections are trusted on both sides. There's a great deal of anxiety among voters on both sides about how our elections are going. And I think what we tend to have is this sort of little bit dialogue of the deaf of one side saying, what you're concerned about is all wrong, or what you're concerned about doesn't legitimize or take into account real fears that I have. And the responses shouldn't really be to say one side's fears are right or wrong. Instead, it's to say, how do we change this whole structure and change the incentives in the structure so that neutral professionals are doing as much of the management of election as possible and as much of the governance of elections as possible to increase the reliability of the system from all perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, to you, Matt, I'm wondering if, partisanship in elections and really every aspect of American society is something that is not new, right? It's been going on for a while. But I'm wondering, in the process of writing this report and some of your big takeaways, what sort of surprised you to dig into about our current reality? And what do you think is kind of sort of the most urgent factor in all of this?
Well, I'll give you the worrisome things. But first, I'll say the vast majority of election officials, almost every election official, does their job in a professional way. They, of course, have partisan interests. They are humans, but they run their offices in a professional way. They want to get the count right? So that's the most important thing to know. One thing I think is getting a lot of attention right now from the media and from groups across the political spectrum is that we have people who are running for Secretary of State races, positions, that just don't believe the 2020 vote count. And that's actually the framework of their entire campaign, the reason why they're running. That's worrisome, and I think we should acknowledge that that's problematic. But if you look at how the system of elections works in this country, it's still very decentralized, even state level down to the localities. We don't necessarily want election deniers at the Secretary of State level. But more concerning is the local issue. I think that's the more important one because they do have access to voting systems, they do have access to ballots. If somebody wanted to do nefarious things, being a local election official gives you kind of that potential, and it's really hard to stop that kind of problem. States try to make sure that they are overseeing those local offices, but local election officials in many places have a lot of responsibility and it's outside of the state purview. So that is one of the things that I think got to me, that it's a very complex problem. We have 8,000 election jurisdictions in this country and no real good way of monitoring that in any kind of comprehensive scale.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point because one of the benefits of having a decentralized election system is it makes the system less vulnerable to kind of widespread outside attacks, for example, by foreign adversaries. But it does mean that in every jurisdiction, the security of the voting system is dependent on the person who runs it, and that person may be influenced by partisan factors. And if they're an independently elected official, there is oftentimes little recourse, although there are things which we'll get into later about ways to mitigate against those incentives. But since you mentioned election officials, we are extremely lucky today to have with us two current and former election officials, Chris Harvey, former elections director in Georgia, and Seth Bluestein, who's a Philadelphia city commissioner. And I'm looking forward to hearing from both of you about how partisanship has changed your jobs day to day on the ground, starting with Chris. I know you started out as an investigator in the Secretary of State's office before becoming the elections director. So I'm really curious to hear from your standpoint how partisanship has intensified the process in your day-to-day work in that time over those years.
Well, sure. Well, again, thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be sharing the screen with so many people who have so much experience. I came by the elections world sort of sideways. I spent 20 years in law enforcement and then was appointed the state election director for then Secretary Brian Kemp, of course, now Governor Brian Kemp, in 2015. And of course, we experienced a lot of this in 2018. You may remember we had an election involving Stacey Abrams and then Secretary Kemp. And this was one of the big issues that was raised sort of nationally was, is there a conflict of interest? Is it, how can he do this? How can he be the Secretary of State and run for the election? Well, the short answer was it's in the law. He was certainly allowed to do it. There was no conflict legally, but it generated a lot of interest nationally even. So it became an issue. I think Kevin hit the target when he talked about the larger stratification in our society and nobody trusting anybody. And people working in good faith. I don't think good faith is really a commodity that we trade much in anymore. And I'll give you an example. I live in the city of Decatur, which is probably the most blue part of the state of Georgia. It's right around Emory University. Great people, but it's a very, very decidedly blue area. And after the 2018 election, I had neighbors, I had family members, I had people at my church that came out and said, I can't believe you did all this bad stuff in 2018, all this Brian Kemp, all this bad stuff. And then after 2020, those same people were coming out of, I was literally walking my dog through the neighborhood and I had people coming out of their house to come shake my hand and thank me for everything that I did in 2020. And what I told them in both cases, I said, I did the exact same thing in 2018 and 2020. I led the state to legally conduct elections. And so, the team, the side that wins is generally happy and the side that loses is generally unhappy. But my experience has been that at the ground level, when you get to the county level, the people are dedicated professionals that want to do the right thing. They want to run elections by the book. They want to do it. They frankly don't really care that much about the outcome. They just want to be able to look back and say, I did the right thing. I got it done well, and I'm satisfied with the results. And I think that as we go forward, and we experienced this in Georgia after 2020, when you get down to the facts, when you look at when you do the audits, we did a hand count of every presidential vote in Georgia right after the 2020 election, and it verified what was on the machines. It verified what the paper and we did a hand count, we did a machine recount, and we did the election night count, and they all matched up. And so that's what I think we've got to focus on is that's going to be the only thing that really cuts through all the rhetoric that Kevin and Matt have talked about. And it may not do it alone, but that's where we've got to start is let's get back to the basics and say, hey, let's have transparency, let's have accountability, let's have audits, and the facts will be the facts.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. That's all really fascinating. And yes, to election audits, it's been really great to see so many states experimenting with new ways of doing audits and doing them publicly. Now moving to Seth in Philadelphia. Thank you so much for being here. And I'd love to hear, similar to what I asked Chris, how did you get into elections and how has increasing partisanship changed your job over the years?
Sure, thank you for having me. I served for the past 10 years as a deputy commissioner for former city commissioner Al Schmidt. So we've been involved with running elections in Philadelphia for 10 years now, including the past 3 presidential elections. And, like Chris, whenever the result is different than what one party prefers, they have questions. But at the end of the day, the county officials who are running the elections are doing the same thing every election, every year, day in and day out. And, the good news about 2020 is the guardrails around our democratic institutions held. In large part, that was thanks to individuals like Secretary Raffensperger, former Commissioner Schmidt, who, did the right thing. But I think going forward, there's a lot of smart people working very hard to find ways to strengthen those guardrails so that if individuals come into office who do not have the same integrity as a lot of officials had in 2020, there are ways to build the system around them to prevent any concerns from happening. And partisan incentives have always existed in elections, whether that's from mayors or secretaries of state or governors or elections officials who are elected. The difference that we saw in 2020 is, I think, a relatively new phenomenon of moving towards election subversion. And that's when, we know what the results are. We have the canvas. We do multiple audits, which we did in Philadelphia. We had 2 audits of the 2020 election. And, at the end of the day, those results need to be accepted. And if there are attempts to subvert those results after all of that has taken place, that's where we really have concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. Pennsylvania has obviously seen a lot of changes to its elections of the last few years alone without everything that happened in 2020. And moving, thinking about the report, one of the findings, I believe, is a chart from the Election Reformers Network, found that in the US, about 60% of local officials are partisans, either elected or appointed as partisans, and the other 40% are nonpartisan. And when you get to the state level, the majority of chief election officials in states are elected or appointed partisan secretaries of state or lieutenant governors in a couple states. And we've obviously discussed how those can create bad incentives, conflicts of interest. So before I delve into a nerdy discussion about improving chain of custody and audit procedures, I'm wondering, sort of taking a step back a little bit, starting with Matt and Kevin, if you want to share maybe some of the other ways that election officials could be selected and appointed into office or not appointed into office in the United States, maybe some alternative methods, if you want to start, Kevin.
Terrific, thank you. Yeah, it's a good question. One approach we've been looking at is the system that's used to select judges in about half the states in the country. In the past, judges have been elected, and in some states they're still elected, just like secretaries of state are elected. And it turns out in those systems, a lot of the campaign money comes from businesses and individuals with interest before the court. And even if you put a nonpartisan label on a judge election, you can often get pretty partisan outcomes because the parties rally around either side. So states that have found a better way do something called merit selection. And that means getting together a group of people who have professional qualifications and that represent a range of different stakeholders to nominate the best qualified people. And so that's how judges are selected. So that's sort of the gold standard of how you get, a neutral person on the bench. So we could use the exact same system to get a neutral person in the role of Secretary of State. We call it an election official nominating commission model, sort of along the line. In the judicial case, it's called a judicial nominating commission. And we think it's a really interesting idea of using something already working and applying it to this critical judgment space of running elections, which is quite analogous to the critical space of being on the state Supreme Court. So that's one method. There are a lot of others, but that's one to look at.
Interesting. What about you, Matt? What other possible ways of selecting election officials did you all discuss in the report?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly other models that we are using throughout the country, right? I mean, we have bipartisan electoral commissions that institute or institutionalize having Ds and Rs as part of the process, and there are pros and cons to that, right? I mean, when you have a bipartisan commission that is equally divided, you can have gridlock. So it's not a perfect solution either, but at least you mitigate some of the risks around partisan influence going down to the local level. The other option, of course, is having a nonpartisan election commission, right? And like most of the rest of the world, and we do have one good example of that in Wisconsin in this country, but that hasn't worked out that well, right? I mean, the one negative for that is that the person who leads that commission has very little political support from either side, right? Because neither party seems that invested. And even though I think in the election official community, Megan Wolf, who is the director of that commission, is seen as one of the best election officials in the country, she is struggling against both Democrats and Republicans to get the resources that she desperately needs to do elections well in her state. So there are options, but none is perfect. So I think what we were hoping with this report is to lay out some of those other options for sure, and talk about the pros and cons, right? Because elections are one way, they have a lot of cons, and maybe at this point, those cons have now overtaken some of the pros.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, as the report notes, an official being selected in a partisan way doesn't necessarily mean that they'll act improperly, but it is about this whole system of incentives and what that creates. And I think the comparison to judges is really, really fascinating. Because in some states where judges are appointed, there are concerns about, political patronage and nepotism and insularity. But of course, judicial elections, like elections for election administrators, can also create just a lot more partisanship and the need to raise money and face negative ads. So I think that is a really, really interesting and apt comparison. Now, moving back to our election officials, Chris, I'm wondering from your standpoint, how do you think about the way that election officials are selected either in Georgia or nationwide? And also, someone who has a lot of experience working really at a granular level in elections, what are some guardrails and safeguards and ways to kind of put checks built into the system that as it exists now to mitigate partisan influence or interference?
In Georgia, election officials are not elected. They're generally appointed by a board in most counties. We've got 159 counties, and I think about 130 have combined boards of election and registration. And they all do it a little bit. They don't all do it, but many of them do it differently. Some have 5 members, some have 7. Sometimes they're appointed by party, and then the chairperson is appointed by the local governing commission. And that board is the election superintendent. But even they then go out and hire a director to basically run the office. So you sort of have 2 levels at the county level. You have the board that is usually bipartisan, and then they will hire an elections director who will actually do the work. And so you kind of have 2 levels. In some counties, they have processes whereby counties can nominate a slate of people. Hey, these are our nominees for the election board, and then maybe the governing committee will pick from those people that they nominate. So it diffuses it a little bit. I know that the 2-party system is so integral to elections, especially in Georgia, that it would be almost impossible to separate out completely. But I think generally most of the associations in Georgia, most of the boards have a requirement for some amount of bipartisanship, but they're generally odd numbers. So you may have 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and then the county commission chair or the county commission will appoint the chairperson, who's probably going to reflect the political leanings of that. So I don't know that we can ever get rid of it completely. And there are allegations back and forth and suggestions back and forth, but really at the end of the day, when you look at the work that's being done, a lot of that is just noise. And if you get beyond the noise and you look at the ballots and you look at the data, you'll find they're generally doing a pretty good job. And I would just point out, I think Matt said that Megan Wolf in Wisconsin. I would just echo that. I think Megan is fantastic, and she's a wonderful elections director.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important point too about how, when you really look at the granular level, things are the vast majority of the time, 99 out of 100 are being done correctly and according to procedure. And of course, that never gets the most attention or gets the most praise, even though it arguably should. And also, I think Georgia is a great example too of how these things like, moving to paper ballots, having more transparency around logic and accuracy testing, chain of custody procedures, and being able to break down frame by frame that way, as officials did after 2020, we take it for granted, but it makes a huge difference. And moving now to Seth, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how election officials in Pennsylvania or otherwise, could be selected to their positions differently, if you think the system should be changed, and what other tweaks and safeguards have either been employed in Pennsylvania or should be used?
Yeah, as a current election official in a position that is elected, I certainly have some thoughts on this topic. But in all seriousness, I think the most important part is having the checks and balances on these boards of election. In Pennsylvania, most counties have 3-person boards, so that there is bipartisan representation without the gridlock of being evenly divided. And that, to me, that is at the end of the day the most important part, because even if you go to a merit selection appointment model, there is still somebody making that appointment. And we see that with the United States Supreme Court, with other courts. The person gets appointed is still affiliated to some degree with the person making the appointment. And funnily enough, in Pennsylvania, we actually have elections for our judges, and we appoint our Secretary of State, which is different than a lot of places, I suppose. But I think what we need to look at is how we incentivize the people on those boards to make the right choices. And I think what Matt said at the very beginning about formalizing some of these ethics rules to limit what the members on the boards are able to do is probably the most important direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And just briefly, I'm curious to hear about sort of on the procedural level, even if we don't completely overhaul and change the system, what are some sort of day-to-day things that can be done, or sort of procedures and ways to sort of limit this outside influence? That's an open question for anyone who wants to.
I'll chime in on that for a second. I meant to include this in my previous answer. One of the problems local election officials have is that they're sort of often treated like, Christmas or holiday decorations. You put them in the attic until October or November, and then you pull them out and you expect all the light bulbs to work and everything to run perfectly. And one of the positive things I think coming out of a lot of this turmoil is that people are paying more attention to elections, and that's a good thing. The problem is they're not always getting the support and the recognition of, hey, this is not something you do for three weeks in November. This is something that's happening every day, and you're doing things like list maintenance, and you're registering voters, and you're doing redistricting. And this is stuff that needs to be done by qualified people that are well trained and well supported and well resourced. And people love to talk about, voting is the most sacred thing we do in a democracy. And then you come back and you look at some of the salaries and some of the resources that are available for locals, and you kind of scratch your head saying, really, is it that valuable? It's not always reflected. So I think if we can take this interest in elections and sort of, push off some of the craziness and really focus on the nuts and bolts and give these professionals the respect and the support they deserve on a 365-day-a-year basis, I think that's going to help too. But you pull somebody out of a box and expect them to run perfectly, once or twice a year with minimal support, when the rules are constantly being changed around them, and expect perfection. I think we have to recognize that it's not a seasonal thing. It's an everyday critical part of our democracy that we've got to make work, and we've got to put resources behind.
Yeah, if I could just jump on that. I mean, that's very key, right? I mean, we've never resourced election officials. We've never paid them what they deserve. But the job is also way different than I think most Americans envision it. It's not a simple deploy the resources that come back to the voting office and we count the ballots. It's a cybersecurity job now. It's logistics expert. It's a people management job. And if we want good qualified people in those positions, then we're going to have to pay for that. That's certainly key. The thing I'd add to that, and I'm going to do a shameless plug for all of the other good work that's coming out of the Elections Project, is that we have 200 plus years of election law that's built up in states, right? And there's a lot of gray area in there. There's a gray area around observers and challengers, who could be in the polling place and when. And for example, and audits now are big. Well, the rules are somewhat better, but they could be improved more. And I think that what we need to do is be a little bit more deliberate in how we're crafting our election policies. Certainly some discretion is necessary. We want people to do innovative things, but we also want election officials to have clear, consistent statutes that aren't overlapping, that aren't contradictory. And in some states, that's just not the case. And it requires a lot more, on the ground decision making. And that's where certainly you have opportunities for partisan kind of bias or influence to creep in.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really crucial point about year-round funding and support. And even just thinking about this year, election officials are still contending with the ongoing pandemic, supply chain issues that are causing paper shortages. I was at a roundtable on Capitol Hill about that issue recently, redistricting, districts changing, and it really is never-ending work, which is a lot of times not fully appreciated. Now we will turn to some audience questions. As a reminder, questions be submitted in the YouTube chat or on Twitter with the hashtag BPC Live. The first question from Scott: what differentiation do you make between full-time public servants who administer elections and the volunteer part-time partisan electoral boards?
I might just jump in and others will probably answer that, but I think that's really a key question. And I think it's kind of come up here. You know, there's a lot of professionalism that is growing in the kind of core staff of getting the work of elections done. And in a sense, the key problems that we really wanted to highlight in this report has more to do with what we should call the governance level, the boards, the Secretary of State. And I think I think which hasn't come up yet, which is a real vulnerability spot, are states that have partisan canvass or certification players. Michigan has, you know, R&D, 2 Democrats, 2 Republican county canvass boards. And as we saw, that was sort of a real point of failure when you get one side that refuses to do what is basically a ministerial function. And it's those kinds of things that I think we really ought to go back and look through and say, what exactly is the reason for the 2 parties to be represented in a body that certifies the results? Is that something that is needed, is normal? Is it, you know, most states don't do that. If it becomes a point of failure, even though it's bipartisan, 2 R's and 2 D's, if one side can put up its hand and say, no, I refuse to accept, why should we build in that vulnerability into our system? So I think it's those governance vulnerability spots are places that we should really emphasize.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that before I go to our next question? All right. Next question from Connie Hester. Does merit selection include any public participation?
I mean, I can take that unless someone else wants to, but since we focused on that, the way it works in the judicial case is there are representatives of the American Bar Association and then other representatives, sometimes selected by governors or by legislators, and they kind of form a group that nominates the officials. Often there is a public role in, there's a lot of transparency around applicants, and sometimes like the interviews of the applicants are live or are available to watch. But there isn't sort of citizens representatives in those bodies the way that there are in, say, independent redistricting commissions. But on the election side, to use this idea on the election side, it could be, you know, it could be an element to include. And I think there is a lot to learn from the redistricting commissions and the success they have had in bringing in a broader range of stakeholders than just the 2 parties in order to make the difficult political decisions about where districts will lie and how to do that in a fair way.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that one?
Grace, the one thing I would add about public participation in the selection of our elections officials is actually, if you look at the election model for selecting who the election officials are, there is a major role for the public to play. And if we want to talk about putting individuals into these offices who, you know, care deeply about our democratic institutions and doing the right thing and making nonpartisan decisions, you know, the voters themselves, you know, not just Democrats and Republicans, but all voters, you know, have a major role to play in who those individuals are who are running these institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really important point. Next question from Steve Colbert. Kevin and Matt compared election official selection to judge selection. Let's extend the comparison to codes of ethics. Do any codes of ethics apply to election officials, and do those codes regulate partisan activity as with judges?
Matt, I mean, I've got an answer to it, but you want to go, Matt?
Yeah, I'll say there are some codes of ethics that are out there for election officials. The Election Center, which is a National Association of Local Election Officials, has one. I believe the National Association of Secretaries of State has one, or maybe even NASED, which is state election officials. There are codes out there. I think at this point, though, codifying into state law the expectations of election officials is probably the next step to at least mitigate some of those concerns.
Yeah, those codes are mostly voluntary, and so making them into law would help a lot. We did an analysis on the issue of conflict of interest and whether state conflicts of interest laws would prevent, say, a Secretary of State from acting to help their own candidacy or to help their party. And although that doesn't happen, I don't want to, exaggerate the degree of risk or the degree to which there have been problems in the past, but at least in terms of what the conflict of interest laws say, they do not prevent some of those potentially self-serving acts. And it would be pretty easy to sort of make those changes in law to help fortify that.
Yeah, super interesting. Next question from Avery Davis Roberts, the Carter Center. Matt mentioned that most other countries have nonpartisan commissions. Are there good international models for how to have a truly independent and impartial election admin authority?
Well, I think Avery is probably the expert on this, but I'm going to turn to Kevin, who's done more work on the international space.
I mean, it is a good question. There are a couple of relevant models. I mean, Canada across the border is quite interesting. There, it's an individual, not a board, but each of the Canadian provinces has a chief election official, and the nation, there's a federal chief election official as well. And each legislature or assembly has procedures for how that person is selected. There's an interesting quirk to the law. Most of them are prevented from voting as a way of sort of not kind of accepting this notion that everyone has to be partisan and we should, assume that their partisanship is going to be part of their makeup and something they bring into the job. The Canadians sort of set this up to say, no, there are some people who believe so much in the process that they don't care who wins. And they're going to symbolize that by that person should not vote. And so just on a symbolic level, I think that's kind of an interesting model. Australia also has a very good model of 3-member boards that are selected, often involving former judges, but again, have small enough to be effective, but broad enough to be representative. And it's fairly technocratic. The lead member of those boards is always either a demographer, statistician, someone who has sort of those core skills that are really important to elections. And these commissions are in place in, I think it's 60 or 70 different countries. So there's a lot of different examples out there if states wanted to start exploring those options. But it's a good question and a good thing for us to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. Really interesting to think about and learn about how other countries do things, especially as the United States and our various democracy building, nation building efforts. We notably have not recommended that other countries have the same kind of hodgepodge system we do, which I always think is very interesting. The next question from Tessalia. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Very importantly, what is the best way to evaluate what impartial conduct is?
That's kind of at the root of this whole discussion is anyone truly impartial? And I think to pretend that somebody is going to be 100% objective on everything is just maybe not realistic. I mean, even with these independent things, somebody's gonna find a tweet from 7 years ago where somebody said something favorable about this, and they're going, aha, we know that now they support this, and they're all the objectivity has gone out the window. So I understand sort of the impetus to kind of move in that direction, but especially in our current climate, I'm just not sure how realistic it is to expect people to be so objective. And if you think about it, somebody that hasn't demonstrated any opinion on any matter, would they even be well informed enough to deal with some of these challenges and issues? So it's we may be asking for a level of moral and ideological purity that just doesn't exist. So I think to recognize that that's going to be a challenge, and it would be almost impossible to set a bar that somebody would be able to meet. I think I do like the idea judges as sort of an example, and I think there's merit in looking at how that's done. But I think we need to be a little bit careful about expecting to get some type of purity from anybody walking around on a pair of legs.
I'm going to just disagree just for the fun of it, because I like the sports analogy, and we all know that, no major sports league would be successful if there were doubts about the neutrality of the referees or umpires, but no one expects them to be, imagine most baseball umpires were baseball fans when they grew up, and you never, are told, well, this ump actually grew up in New York, so he probably leans a little bit toward the Yankees, not the Red Sox or whatever it might be. No one expects perfection, but at the same point, teams aren't involved in picking the umpires. Teams have nothing to do with them. And here we sort of have this situation where our sport of elections, the competing teams are pretty deeply involved in, who gets to be behind the plate making the calls. And I think there's good reason why people feel like that's not quite right. We could find something where we're not getting perfect impartiality, but we're getting more impartiality.
I would agree with striving for that would be a good thing. I don't disagree with that.
Yeah, this is a really, really fascinating line of discussion. I think the question does hit on that idea. And this is also something I do within the journalism profession is how impartial should we strive to be? Should we strive to have a completely neutral view? This whole neutrality versus fairness debate. I think it's something all of us in public facing kind of professions have to contend with all the time. Does anyone else have any other thoughts on this question before we wrap up? It's a really interesting one.
Yeah, just one thing that I would add, certainly, I think Chris and Kevin make good points, right? And we've laid out kind of the problem. Where we're seeing some energy, though, is actually going in the wrong direction. Now, we've seen some state legislatures over the past year think about inserting the partisan legislature into aspects of certification or overseeing elections directly. That would be, I think, the very wrong direction to go in, right? And so, I know we're running out of time and we have to wrap up, but while the solutions that we put out here aren't easy and they probably aren't going to go as far as some people like, I think it's important to just note that some of the energy is actually to make it a little more partisan. And that would probably, I think, hopefully, we'd all agree is just the wrong direction for us.
Yeah, it's a really, really important crystallization of the entire report. And on this point about legislatures, at the same time as many are, as you know, looking to exert more partisan control over elections, at least one in Colorado, they've been thinking and working on legislation to try to put sort of more checks and balances, especially at the local level, at the county level. And those are all some really interesting ideas too that we could talk about for several hours. We are now running out of time. So I just want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you to the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Election Reformers Network for hosting this great event. Recommend everyone read the full report on neutralizing partisan incentives in election administration. And huge thank you to all of our panelists who took time out of their days to come and discuss this extremely important topic today. Highly recommend you follow everyone on Twitter if you're interested in this topic. Matt Weil, Kevin Johnson, the Election Reformers Network, Chris Harvey, and Commissioner Seth Bluestein of Philadelphia. Thank you all so much for being here and for sharing your thoughts on this really, really crucial topic. Highly recommend everyone follow the Bipartisan Policy Center, BPC_bipartisan on Twitter. Election Reformers Network too. I am Grace_Panetta on Twitter if you want to follow me. And thank you so much everyone for being here and joining us today. I really, really appreciate it. And thanks so much everyone for a fantastic discussion.
Thank you, Grace.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.